Hello and welcome back to the Road to Mythic Plus title. In the last episode, we took on a plus 23 Murazon's Rise and Waycrest Manor, but we ran into some problems along the way and were unable to complete both keys. This brings us to the second and current episode in our Mythic Plus adventure, where immediately following our previously unsuccessful keys, we've queued into a plus 22 Rise, ready to run it back in this dungeon for a second, and hopefully more successful, time. So we're back in Murazon's Rise, this time joining a group hosted by the one and only Angry Hobo. The start of this run is going fine. We have a couple deaths early on, one to a bolstered maiden, and the other coming from the lizard. It has this one mechanic where it'll charge to a certain area, spawn this sandstorm looking thing, and incapacitate one random player, dragging them to its location. To stop this ability, one of the other players in your party needs to interrupt the lizard, but in order to do so, you have to go run inside of the sandstorm. This being because the sandy area acts to line of sight everything inside and outside of it. So if you're outside, you can't target anything inside, and if you're inside it, you can't target anything outside it. Unfortunately, nobody can get to our warrior in time, and he ends up falling over. We blast through the rest of the trash and kill the first boss with little to no issues, then moving on to the next trash pack. If you recall back to episode 1, I made a point about making better decisions about where I send my cooldowns. Well, this is a great example because like last time, I again go into this next trash pack without my cooldowns, and here we lose 2 of our party to the Infinite Schism, Infinite Fury overlap, which to be fair, even if I had my damage cooldowns, we probably weren't killing them quick enough to avoid this set. It's more so that we need to use defensives in this moment, and the healer has to have throughput prepped for it. Right, so you see me pressing Feint and Crimson Vial going into this overlap. Feint reducing all area of effect damage by 50%, and then Crimson Vial healing 25% of my health over 4 seconds. But we do still manage to get through it, which then takes us to the gauntlet, and well, this happens. But 2 minutes later, we made it to the double dragon pack and can actually progress with the dungeon. The dragons then don't present much of an issue, and we move past them into the next gauntlet. Now this section of the room, or gauntlet, whatever you want to call it, the goal is to carve a path through the sand to the portals on the edge of the room. You can't just run through the sand because it deals damage to you. Now the way you carve this path is that when you kill an ad, it will clear a little section around it. So by continuing to pull in more ads and then killing them right beside the sand or sometimes on top of it, you'll be able to then carve your path. And once a path has been cleared to the portals and all rift mages are dead, you can advance to the next part of the dungeon. In my experience, usually this section of the dungeon is rather uneventful, which is why I skipped it in the previous episode, but here I actually end up dying, and the reason is kind of funny. So there are 2 things here. Thing 1 is that ads will spawn from the portals left by the rift mages around the room. These ads will then randomly run into us. When that happens, the tank just needs to pick them up and we DPS them down. Okay, so that's thing 1. The second thing is that I play Assassination Rogue, which runs Caustic Spatter, and I have abilities like Kingsbane. So the way Caustic Spatter works is that when applied, all of the poison damage I deal to an enemy, a portion of that damage splashes to all nearby targets. Then Kingsbane is a ramping dot. The final couple ticks of the Kingsbane dot will hit very hard, and because of Caustic Spatter, a portion of that damage splashes to nearby targets. So maybe you piece together where I'm going with this, but then the following occurs. Oh my god, I'm dead, 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 I'm alive, I'm dead, okay. So a new set of ads spawn in as I'm at the peak of my ramp, meaning I'm doing a lot of damage to the ads before the tank has an opportunity to establish threat, and I end up going down. Now, there are definitely things I could have done there to better increase my chances of surviving. I could have used tricks on the tank, redirecting all of my threat to the tank. I could have used evasion, but in the heat of the moment when I saw all the nameplates change color, I definitely panicked. Thankfully, the run back is pretty close, so it didn't cost us too much time. Moving on here, unlike our last Murazon's Rise, this time our group chooses to go to Battlefield first. Now, this dungeon is unique in the sense that you can choose which boss you go to second. I think the more common strategy is to do Morchi first. This is just because of the way lust timings work out. I think most groups prefer to have Bloodlust for Battlefield, and as you can see right now, we don't have Lust for another 5 minutes. Then we arrive at Battlefield. You must kill 2 mini-bosses to spawn the boss. Since it's a fortified week, the mini-bosses actually scale and deal more damage. And in particular, the tank's mechanic to launch mortars at a targeted player is very scary if you don't have immunity or don't know how to deal with it. And at the time of doing this dungeon, I didn't have my immunity up and I didn't know how to deal with it. So we do go down here, but it's funny watching this back because I've since learned how to deal with mechanic. And the way you deal with it is that the little swirlies will spawn around your character based on where your character is pointed. So the safest method is to just run along the perimeter of the room. If you do that, you don't have to worry about much. The next mini boss then has these earthquakes, which you just have to pre-move for, and you want to make sure you kick both the ads and the main boss. The ads will use Rallying Cry, and the main boss will heal itself. So here, just set one as a focus and then kick it whenever it casts. The cast goes out very quick, so you generally don't have time to wait to see which ad gets kicked before then kicking one ad. I'm at least ensuring that one of the ads gets kicked, and I'm hoping that somebody else in my party can get the other one. After finishing off the mini bosses, the main boss will spawn. The start of this fight is going fine. I think our hunter dies early on to standing in a blade storm. I can't really tell from my point of view, but it's hard to imagine any other way they would go from full health to 0. So we end up sending a battle res to pick them up. Now the hunter dying to blade storm, probably an accident. It's a pretty easy mechanic to avoid, just like the boss's shockwave. What makes this encounter dangerous are the ads that spawn. In particular, the axe thrower or the archer, depending on whether you get the horde or alliance version of this fight, have an ability that if it goes off at this key level, it's almost a guaranteed death. And unfortunately, in our group, we do not do a good job of stopping this cast. So we see our hunter gets hit by it and goes down. We do have a second battle res, so we're able to pick them up, but then our healer gets targeted with it. We again don't stop this cast, and our healer goes down. Now, something I'm not sure about is how you stop the cast. I used to think you could only stop the axe thrower by stunning the serrated blade cast. So in my case as a rogue, I have my finger on the trigger ready to hit a kidney or a blind the moment it goes off. But I don't know if they changed the encounter, or maybe it's always been this way, but it seems like every time you attack with direct damage, it stops the cast. I'm not sure if anyone can confirm this, but as an assassination rogue, I don't think I should be the person to run out and stop it. Assuming the cast breaks on damage, I think it should be our hunter's responsibility to stop the cast since they're the only ranged DPS class in our group. But whether or not that's the case, nobody stops the cast and we slowly rot out. Luckily, however, we do deal enough damage to the boss that our blood DK is able to finish it off. So it's not a full wipe, but the rest of our group has a long run back. Now, this is where things get a little weird. So you'll notice that as we're running to the portal, we're weaving our way between ads. We don't need to kill these ads. They do give count and percent that you need to finish the dungeon. If you don't know what count is, if you look at the bar at the bottom of where the boss timers are, that bar indicates how much percent and count we need, and you get that from killing the trash in the instance. And the reason this is there is to ensure that you don't just skip all the trash in a dungeon, so there's some minimum requirement of trash that you need to complete. So our group runs through to the portal, but our Holy Paladin aggroes one of the trash mobs. And you can't take the portal when you're in combat. So the Holy Paladin is just on their own trying to solo some mob, but they're not able to do it, so they end up dying, while the rest of our group's proceeding forward. Now, I don't think I've even noticed it at this point, but if I was to have seen that they died, my guess would be, okay, they accidentally butt pulled, they'll just release, run back, and meet up with us. And we'll just have to wait a bit longer for them to get here. But as it turns out, that doesn't end up being the case, because they pull again and die again. But at this point, I'm already long gone, and our group ends up being pretty split here. I'm positioned ready to attack the next trash pack and then the third boss, but the rest of our group turned around to help our healer get through. Now maybe I'm at fault here and I should have head back to help our healer, but again, I didn't realize that our healer was having issues until I arrived at the trash just before Morchi, and because it takes so long to run here, I kind of figured, okay, well, by the time I run all the way back, they'll probably have dealt with whatever they need to deal with, and if I get caught on a long ferry ride on one of these dragons going the opposite way, I might end up wasting even more time. So I just sit there and wait for them to arrive, and by the time they arrive, it's been about 5 minutes. So we were already cutting the timer kind of close, but at this point, it's pretty much for sure not going to happen. And in fact, I don't think we needed this trash pack. I think we could have skipped it and had enough percent to finish the dungeon, but we end up pulling it. The healer dies again. I mean, this guy's having a real bad time at this point. and we end up going into Morchi. Now, I'm certain that we're not going to time this key, but I stick around in case they want to finish. And Morchi goes about as well as you would imagine. About halfway through the fight, Morchi spawns copies of ourselves that we need to run away from. Our healer unfortunately is a little too slow to react and gets meleeed, while at the exact same time, Angry Hobo eats a frontal. I see this happen and think, alright, that's GG's. I jump off the edge and we die here, and that's key. So that means this is our third bricked key tonight, and we're 0 for 2 in Murazon's Rise. So we're back in LFG looking to pug into another group, and it doesn't take long before we manage to land ourselves in another plus 22 Rise. Now at this point in the series, we've seen a lot of this dungeon, so I'm just going to skip through this run to the interesting bits. And interesting thing 1 happens on the second pull of the dungeon. Our tank opts to pull the Keeper into the big lizard man. Now these two adds in and of themselves aren't really that bad, but the problem is that this pull has a necessary kick with the lizard and 3 necessary kicks with the volleys from the Maguses. Managing all these kicks and ensuring nothing goes through in a pug environment is very difficult to pull off with this many mobs. And not only that, we also then pull the patrol, aka another Magus and another kick, into this huge pull. So the lizard starts running around and assassinating people, myself included, because we don't have the coverage to stop the lizard and all the other Maguses, and we rack up several deaths here. We do manage to finish the pull, but at the cost of a lot of time and 4 deaths. As a side note, if you're newer to Mythic Plus, deaths not only set your group back because obviously you're no longer there to help, but each death adds a 5-second penalty to your timer. Now 5 seconds isn't a lot of time, but over the course of an entire key with many deaths, it can sometimes be the difference between timing a key or not. So we're going to do a big jump to Battlefield here. We have a couple deaths on the way, but nothing super significant, and I get once again targeted by a volatile mortar. This time, however, I've learned from my mistakes and I do the mechanic correctly both times that I get targeted. Although in the second time, our tank just randomly dies, which was a little weird, but we had B-res so we were able to get him back up. Second side note here, the way battle res works in Mythic Plus, several classes have access to a battle res, but you only get one every 10 minutes. So you start the instance with one, and for every 10 minutes that passes, you gain an additional battle res charge. So in this case, we have a charge available and we send it on our tank. We proceed to slam both mini bosses, then spawning the main boss, but then make some questionable decisions. So we're just over a minute away from our third Bloodlust, and I think the tank and healer were pretty big on having Bloodlust for this boss, so the idea was that we would clear some trash while waiting for the Bloodlust timer to come off cooldown. But the reason this is a little bit questionable is because we didn't really need percent. We still had to kill the one trash pack before Chromie, and then there's one last trash pack that you can't skip before the final boss. Now maybe the tank was planning to skip the trash pack before Chromie, I don't know, but I don't think we needed to pull this. If we really wanted Bloodlust, we were probably just better off waiting, because this trash sucks. All these mobs have a channeled ability that needs to be stopped, and we don't pull them back fast enough, so they end up social pulling another pack, and this ultimately wipes us. I also could have lived a bit longer here. You see me press cloak immediately after I die, and that's just me being too conservative with my defensives. So we run it back, first taking down Battlefield and then Chromie. Now to the tank's credit, we did have enough percent to skip the trash pack before Chromie. However, I still think the Chromie trash pack is a lot safer to pull than the one we did, but it was somewhat reassuring to know that the pull we did wasn't entirely for naught. This allows us to move on to the final trash pack in the dungeon, and arguably one of the most dangerous. Despite there only being 3 mobs here, all 3 of these trash mobs deal a large amount of party-wide damage, plus the 2 marauders have necessary kicks that need to get stopped. So I go into this trash pack with my cooldowns, I set one of the marauders as a focus target so I'm ready to kick, and I begin my pre-ramp on the dragon. I then let my focus target get a cast off. This then leads to our mage and healer dying, and we eventually wipe. Now, I have no excuse for this. I should have kicked that mob. There was no reason for me not to. The one thing I will say, and the reason why I didn't kick it or think to kick it, is that normally when doing keys, and in particular when pulling trash packs, your tank is usually the first person to use their kick. Now we were playing with a prop paladin, and prop pallies are known for having many kicks. Like that's kind of their thing. So when we ran in, I was thinking, okay, our prop pally is getting the first couple kicks on these mobs, and then I'm going to look to use my kick. But unfortunately, the prop paladin never kicked, nobody else did, and we wiped. And this is a pretty hard lesson you learn doing pug keys. And that lesson is, it's never a good idea to rely on somebody else that you haven't communicated with to do something you expect should be done. So in this instance, I expected the prop paladin would kick, but because they didn't, I wasn't ready to back up with my kick, and then we wiped. And this is because what makes sense to me or what makes sense to you may not be what the other people in your party are thinking. Maybe the paladin was thinking the DPS would kick, I don't know. But if that communication doesn't happen ahead of time, which by the way is a big part of being successful in keys, if that communication doesn't happen, in order to be successful, you just have to play as safe as possible. Any and every opportunity you have to CC or stop or solve a mechanic, regardless of how bad it is for your damage, at least at the level of keys that I'm currently doing, that solution is almost always your safest bet. Because even if your other party members deal with those mechanics 90% of the time, if you're always covering mechanics whenever you have the ability to do so, that 10% where you would expect them to do something but they don't, you then have coverage for that. Anyways, looking back at the key, you'll notice that we're now just chain wiping to this trash. We've reached a point where we're no longer going to time the key. I asked the party lead if he wants to continue. He's like, nah. And so that is yet another untimed Murazon rise. And just like that, we're back to the LFG hustle. Now, just when things were looking bleak, one of my friends reached out and offered to tank. And so we acquire Wopflop. Now, Wop here is a very strong WoW player. He achieved title last season in Mythic Plus, playing an Augmentation Evoker, and the guy can play pretty much anything. So we end up queuing into a plus 24 rise, and I'll keep this run short because the run itself ends up being short. So what we end up planning is to shroud the first couple packs and go straight into the Maiden with Lust. We discuss it in party chat and then begin the key. But apparently the Warlock didn't get the memo, as only 4 of us made it through. He then proceeded to be very upset and left the key. So yeah, that ended up being a pretty quick run, and the Monk Healer decided to drop it to a 23, and so we run it back. This time around we pull off the Shroud skip successfully and make it to Maiden, except during Maiden, Kanye Blessed gets Kanye orbed and goes down, but we finish off the pack with the 4 of us. The start of this dungeon then goes fine, until we arrive at the 2-pack after tier. Because this trash pack is a case of fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, fool me 3 times, shame on me again, and now it's embarrassing. Because I still don't have my cooldowns for this 2-pack, and we again lose 2 players to this pack when, if it had died a little bit earlier, would not have been the case. But of course, all's forgiven because we're gamers and we one-shot the gauntlet. I suppose if you've had as much practice as I've had, you'd probably one-shot it too. But otherwise, most of the rest of this key goes, I wouldn't say smoothly. In almost every part of the dungeon, we'd have like 1 or 2 deaths to random things, but we never once wiped. So I'm going to skip forward here to the pack of 3 before the last boss that wiped us in the previous run. At this point, we're cutting the timer kind of close. Despite the fact we haven't wiped, we can definitely feel the 11 deaths we've accumulated over the course of this key, and I think this also goes to show just how tight of a timer it is in this dungeon. But we are on pace to time if we can avoid any major mistakes. Now, one of the nice things about running with a tank is that I can trust Wopflop will stop all of the necessary stops so I can just focus on doing my damage. This means the trash pack goes down pretty fast, and while we do lose both our DPS to a bolstered dragon towards the end of the pull, we've already done enough and it falls over shortly after. We then arrive at the last boss with just over 5.5 minutes remaining, which is more than enough time to complete this encounter if we can avoid any major mishaps. Now, the Murazon fight is kind of crazy and is a fairly difficult encounter, but because this is a fortified week, the boss is slightly less intimidating, and we managed to hold it down up until the last 8% of the boss's health, when our hunter goes down to what I assume to be infinite corruption. I can't really tell from my POV, but it seems like the most likely thing to happen. Now, we don't have B-res here, and what's interesting is because the hunter was the only range in our group, that means the balls will start spawning on players in melee. And one of the players in melee has to then stay in their ball so that the other one can fall and the debuff expires before you then drop yours. So to ensure there's no ambiguity here, I type out, I stay, to let the other players know to run out of their orbs right away. Usually this is the responsibility of your range player, but since I recognized they died, I was able to take up this role and we finished the fight, ending the night with a successfully timed plus 23 Murazon's Rise. It felt real good to finally time this key, and we also did it while topping damage. But that's going to wrap up episode 2 of our Road to Mythic Plus title. Next time we'll be messing around with some of the other rogue specs like Outlaw and Subtlety, while also trying to scope out some keys that we can join to potentially push our IO. And if you haven't already, if you don't mind clicking a thumbs up and subscribing, it really helps me out and I appreciate the support. But otherwise, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.